Why isn't gaming fun anymore is a question a lot of people are asking recently, and I wanted to react to this video, but I'm not going to react to the whole video by ThePieFace. I'm going to skip the first section about nostalgia. It's actually really, really good, and I would encourage you to watch the entire video. I don't like my videos to be too long for your sake, so it's a little bit easier for you to watch them, but I also don't like serving as a replacement for the video that I'm reacting to. So it'll be linked below. Support the channel, support the original video. I thought the nostalgic section was great, but the next two sections about has gaming changed, has the world changed, I think is more interesting for the reaction and the dialogue. So let's jump in.
The gaming industry has grown incredibly fast since I first picked up a controller. In fact, in 2021, the games industry raked in more cash than music and film combined. A good bit of this growth can be attributed to the rise of mobile gaming, which in 2021 made up 45% of the total revenue in the industry. And of course, the stench of this heaping pile of cash would not go unnoticed by the insectoid swarm of C-suite executives, and with their grubby little shit-stained appendages and their dungest touch, they've pushed hard to make console and PC gaming monetization more closely resemble that of a mobile game.
I think this is actually like a really well-made point. Like, he really focuses on this, and I think tying it to mobile really is the right tie-in. Obviously, there's tie-ins to live service and mobile as well, but monetization alone, you can see the similarities. But I do think it cuts both ways. I think Fortnite has had, at some level, a greater influence than even mobile games, because Fortnite has influenced mobile games. Like, it kind of goes both ways. And obviously, language warning, I forgot to say that at the beginning. He does swear. Most of my content is safe for work, but this one's going to have some swearing in it. So I do think there's an interrelationship between Fortnite and monetization and what's happened, even if we want to attribute it to mobile gaming. I don't know if it's as clean as that. So
attempting to normalize all the same underhanded tactics which apply psychological manipulation in various ways to pry as much money as they can out of its users in a predatory manner. Whether it's feeding off of players' addictions by implementing gambling adjacent mechanics, or their frustration by creating problems and selling back the solutions, or FOMO with limited time, buy now expensive skins. The online nature of the live service model has primed games for these sort of exploitations. It's not completely without its pushback though, as we gamers have been successful in combating some of these changes, as is the case with loot boxes, as we've pretty much eradicated those from most PC and console games at this point. Though it definitely seems like a losing battle, as every year more ground gives way to the normalization of such strategies, in like a 1 step forward, 10 step back kind of way. For example, if we look back, it wasn't that long ago when DLC was considered outrageous. It was seen as devs taking content out of the original game and holding it back to sell later.
well, and that was a misconception. That to this day is a misconception about DLCs. There's commonly that idea that if they have planned DLC, that they should just give it to you. Like, there should not be anything planned, which is a complete misunderstanding of like development cycles as they function. Typically, if they're already working on DLC, that's being worked on by a team that's essentially done with whatever they had to do for the main game. And now they're working in parallel and saying, okay, let's get something ready, long term. If you look at the cost of making games, it's just become astronomically higher. I do think that's going to be missing from this discussion, which is commonly missing, is it's so unidimensional to be like, well, companies are purely trying to make profit, and there's a lot of profit in gaming and mobile, so they're all ruining gaming. A lot of it is also infecting games that you love, because the games that you love have budgets that are 100 times larger than they used to be. The staff size, the bandwidth, the project length, they're hiring, professional actors and writers. And that's just one more aspect of this that I think a lot of the time gets completely left out, which I think touches on DLC. Like, I do. I think a lot of the times they have planned DLC, or they have content that they're going to sell, ongoing, because they just spent 5 or 6 years building a massive game that I guess you think they're supposed to sell for $60 or $70 and then never do anything with it ever again, and just move on to the next massive, huge, enormous project. And I think that cyclical nature of the dev cycles is one of the other contributing factors here that just commonly gets forgotten. And I know somebody's going to always push back and say, well, it's not the consumer's job to know about that. Okay, well, if as the consumer you're going to start commentating on over monetization and practices that are ruining gaming, you have to consider all the aspects then, or your commentary is going to be sort of one-sided. And I think that's why I typically try to bring it up.
But as always, the ground gave way, and the conversation shifted to whether or not it was day one DLC, or how much effort they put into the DLC, if the content was worth it. Fast forward to today, where similar conversations are being had about the pay-to-win debate, where at first any pay-to-win is completely unacceptable, to now being able to find conversations about how a certain game is not that pay-to-win. But complaining about monetization in games
Wait,
about...
hang on. I need to look at this. So we have MMO pay-to-win scale, so more pay-to-win. All the way up here is paying real money gives you direct benefits or items are otherwise impossible to achieve. Less pay to win. Paying real money gives you access to cosmetics, but there are other ways to unlock them. This shouldn't even be on the same chart. I will always argue this. Paying real money gives you access to purchase-only cosmetics. This shouldn't even be on here. Not at all. Pay to win is nonsensical when we're referring to cosmetics. It's nonsensical. Because pay to win was born out of the idea of creating a culture of you literally paying in order to win, and everybody's doing it, so you feel like you have to pay to win. This is why I've been such a stickler with pay to progress should be called pay to progress. Pay to win should be called pay to win. Like, we have to have clear dividing lines, because if not, you end up with a chart like this, and then someone thinks, yeah, pay to win. It's less pay to win, but it's still pay to win. That's nonsensical given the vernacular of pay to win and what it came from. It doesn't make sense to apply it to cosmetics. So I don't agree with this chart at all. Right here, paying money for minor or indirect benefits. This is exactly when it starts. I think the chart should just start here. Paying real money gives you indirect benefits that are convenient and or time savers. This should be separate. An indirect benefit, sure, that's considered pay to win if it's giving you an indirect benefit over another player. But convenient time savers, progression, things to speed up progression, if it doesn't help you against another player, then it doesn't fit into pay to win. It's pay to progress, which is completely separate. And I do think this is an important thing in this discussion, because if we want to push back against the forces that we feel are harming gaming, then sweeping categories are unhelpful. Everything's pay to win. Well, then this chart basically becomes meaningless then if everything's pay to win, because now you're making it sound like everything is all under the same umbrella.
How a certain game is not that pay to win. But complaining about monetization in games is nothing new or original. In fact, it's an oversaturated market, and at this point just feels like beating a dead horse. It seems you'll never get enough people to care about this topic, and until that happens, nothing will change.
And this is something I've always said, is that the market is doing what the market's supposed to do. Like, stuff hits the market, and if it's supported, then the market bears it. So the commentary around Fortnite skins is one that I always pick on, because people are like, those skins are too expensive, it's ridiculous. The price of something is not determined by your opinion about what it should cost. The price is determined by what the market will bear. This is true in almost any environment. And so if the demand for a product is incredibly high and the company knows it, they'll raise the price because they'll make more money, and they're supposed to do that. Like, that's quite literally their job. They're supposed to generate as much money as possible, because that goes into future projects, future funding. It goes into, if they're publicly traded, their fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So the idea that these companies, shouldn't do these things or shouldn't put these things in, it's like, that's what they're supposed to do. So the market bears it. And that's always going to happen with cosmetics. It's always going to happen with battle passes. If the market supports it and bears it, you just kind of have to hope that this year, especially 2023, I think is interesting that so many of these videos are coming out about how gaming is just terrible, when it's been one of the best years in gaming in a really, really long time. And some of the biggest and most successful games haven't had any of this crap in them. Baldur's Gate 3, Tears of the Kingdom, Hogwarts Legacy, Final Fantasy 16, Spider-Man 2 is on the way. These are games that are not doing live service. They're not jamming themselves packed full of microtransactions. And I think that's sending a loud and clear message that there is still market demand for games that don't do this. That's what you should be doing. You should be throwing your support behind the games that don't do it. That's how you make a change. That's how you maintain at least two separate funnels, like over-monetized, maybe live service games, and then everything else. So support the games that don't do it is always going to be my word. You want the market to do what the market's supposed to do.
Instead, I'd like to talk about a bit of a hot take here, that in the past 10 years, gaming really hasn't changed much at all. The gaming industry feels pretty stagnant. If I compare games as they are now to how I thought they would be by now as a kid, the picture is very disappointing. As a kid who just discovered MMOs like RuneScape and World of Warcraft, I was blown away by the idea of what MMOs could be in the future. I would hop off World of Warcraft and go play Dungeons & Dragons and think, man, one day World of Warcraft is going to have the same level of choice and consequence that I can have with my imagination playing D&D. Now obviously that hasn't happened yet, and as a kid I didn't know anything about game development. But I've heard a similar observation from Razboon in his video series Gaming for a Non-Gamer, which is a great series, and I recommend you check it out.
So Asmongold touched on this in a different way recently, reacting to a guy's video about November Hotels, I think is the name of the channel, and it was about how, graphics don't matter. And Asmongold echoed something I have said for a very, very long time. It was this slope of graphical improvements and how the difference between games right now and 5 years ago, the difference isn't as noticeable. But the difference between games now and 10 years ago is hugely noticeable. The difference when you jumped up from Super Nintendo to Nintendo 64 was like mind-blowing, right? And so we're noticing that trend, and I think that's one of the reasons now people are getting frustrated. They're like, okay, games getting really, really pretty could sort of distract you from the fact that they're not innovating on the content loop, or the game's just bigger now. There's just more to do, right? If you look at like the trajectory of maybe even games like Assassin's Creed, they didn't innovate all that much on the gameplay or the content loop, but they made the game bigger or prettier. And now that they can't really have those leaps in prettiness, everybody's sort of getting this stagnation feel of like, well, you're not doing anything to the games. Like the games feel very, very similar. I think that's probably playing a role here as well with what he's talking about.
Where he discusses his wife's disappointment discovering video games for the first time.
Her expectations for what she thought she could do in each game were always different than the reality, and I think as she realized that games were more simple than she had first assumed, some of the intrigue about them faded.
Interestingly enough, when my wife played Starfield, she picked up everything, overburdened herself. She overburdened Vasco, the robot. And it was like, I tried to tell her they don't expect you to do that. And it was confusing to her. Why do they let me pick everything up if they don't want me to do it, if they're going to hinder me from doing it? So really funny that my wife had a similar outlook of like, why can't I do that? That doesn't make any sense. That, restricting your freedom while offering you tons of freedom seemed strange to her.
There's a massive lack of innovation and risk-taking in the AAA space. As we see games like Skyrim being released 1 billion times, The Last of Us is getting its 3rd version of the game, Call of Duty ran out of ideas and decided to just loop back around and start re-releasing their games in order again, hoping nobody would notice, but they somehow made all the games worse so everyone noticed.
I think some of this is the constraints of a genre, though. Like, when I look at Call of Duty, I'm like, what do you want them to do? They eventually are going to circle back around. My wife and I have been watching the classic Twilight Zone shows. And it's super interesting to me that a lot of the plot lines and a lot of the things they were doing in the Twilight Zone back when the show was being made, a lot of that stuff's being done today. A lot of the same story ideas, time travel and things like that are showing up again. And I think there's just a constraint within a genre. There's only so much you can do within a comedy or a drama or a sitcom. So you start to have things that feel similar. You're like, this feels similar to a show or a movie I've watched before. I do think innovation and creativity is extremely challenging once you put yourself within a genre. It's like, well, it's a first-person shooter, milsim, arena shooter, whatever you want to call, Call of Duty. You got to work within those constraints, and that's going to limit how much you can innovate and create and change things.
Which brings me to my next point, where not only are companies not really interested in innovating at all, but they seem to be actively taking steps backwards in innovation. If you look at something like the original Fallout's super in-depth dialogue system versus Fallout 4's dialogue system, it's a huge step back. And that's a tame example. It gets so much worse. Blizzard, for example, figured out that they can retroactively ruin a 20-year-old game with Warcraft 3 Reforged. Well, I guess that was pretty innovative. The only real innovations coming out of this industry are coming from indie developers and modders.
I agree with this, and there's a reason for this. Scale. When you are a really small studio with 5 employees, you can take those risks because you're not going to ruin or sink a company that employs 500 people, right? You're not publicly traded. You're not going to get sued by your shareholders like CD Projekt Red did, right? When scale and scope gets so large, risk has to be minimized. It simply does. That is something that's always missing from this discussion as well. The cost of games and the budgets and everything has gone up so high that risk must be mitigated at every turn. So of course they're reusing assets or repackaging or remastering. They're trying to subsidize the next massive project, and they cannot afford to be like, let's just try something crazy and wild and innovative, because if it fails, you're talking about financial ruin. I mean, if you look at what the studio that made Immortals of Avium went through, they threw money at it, threw a huge marketing budget at it, got somebody like Gina Torres to be in it, and it didn't do what it needed to do, so the studio's closing. Like that's what we're talking about. You're talking about scale and scope that doesn't allow for that. So of course indies are doing all of the innovation. When there's two people working on a video game, or one or whatever, like the one guy who made Tunic, you can take those risks. And I actually think this is the industry sort of hitting equilibrium where you are seeing more of the freedom and risk being taken by indie titles, which is benefiting the consumer because those are smaller, more consumable games. The prices are lower. I think this benefits us in the long run. Bigger titles and bigger budgets are tending to, I think, having to land in those lanes that are safe and repetitive. And I think you just have to you have to avoid those. You have to avoid those games if you're worried about those things.
The latter of which is responsible for the two biggest genres in the past decade, and that's without even the expectation of getting paid. Isn't that weird? Kind of goes against the conventional capitalist thinking, huh? Looking at the trajectory of the industry, it's really hard to not just be depressed about it all and wonder if the industry can ever course correct.
Again, the course correct from what? This year's been fantastic, and some of the most successful games aren't doing any of the stuff he's talking about. It's really interesting. This is the second video I've watched by a completely different content creator, and it's like they're not paying attention to the games that are coming out. They're only paying attention to the games that are doing the things they don't like, instead of saying like, oh my gosh, maybe we are turning a corner. Maybe studios will start noticing that you can make a game like Baldur's Gate 3 and make tons of money, right? You can make something that isn't riddled with all the bad stuff. Okay, so this is the second part. So again, I like to keep the videos a little shorter for you, so we're probably never going to get, too long-winded, but I'm going to encourage you to watch his entire video. So this is the other part we're going to react to. Has the world changed? Again, the end of the video is he asks the question, has he changed? And the opening is all about nostalgia. The opening on nostalgia is so good. Make sure and watch his video. Make sure and watch the whole thing.
It's weird to think that things like YouTube, Reddit, and all these other social media sites haven't really been around that long. And yet it's sometimes hard to remember what it was like before they existed.
True.
These sites have made data mining, crowdsourced information, and video guides all accessible to everyone at all times.
Yep.
In some cases, the internet will have every bit of information about every mechanic and secret in a given game before they even release.
Yep.
And all of these things have drastically changed how we play video games. Let's take a look at a game like World of Warcraft. If I had to describe how I feel playing retail WoW in one word, it would be emptiness. Not because of a lack of content necessarily, so much as the game just kind of feels soulless. Where before, the game was about adventure and discovery, it is instead now a game about optimization. It's essentially a solved game, where add-ons and logs have optimized gameplay to a T with little room for experimentation or creativity. Which is fine. I mean, no one likes to play suboptimally. I'm not trying to vilify optimization, as it can be quite fun for some people. Take speedrunning, for example. Speedrunning is such an interesting hobby to me. It's something I've always wanted to get into, but I've always felt a little intimidated by. The stuff that people are able to achieve with speedrunning is truly mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Some of which is only really possible because of the interconnected nature of modern gaming, where sharing glitches and exploits is part of the fun of collectively iterating on runs to shave off more and more time. But then if you look...
Did you see what he was doing? That was insane. I love watching people figure that kind of stuff out. Like, imagine spending the time to figure out all those pathways and shortcuts.
Something like RuneScape, one of the most solved games that has become literally all about the optimization. You'll find a community who's made it a tradition of coming up with off-the-wall challenges and restrictions inflicted upon their accounts, also known as snowflake accounts, so that they are forced to forge their own path. There's no guide to follow on how to clear one of the hardest raids in old-school RuneScape if you're not allowed to leave the swamp zone. But one man, after 3 years of theory crafting, grinding, and 33 very entertaining YouTube videos, was able to accomplish that goal, with hundreds and thousands of people watching and loving it. So clearly, the problem for World of Warcraft isn't just optimization itself. It's that optimization isn't just confined to the few who enjoy it, but instead sort of forced onto everyone else. With all these tools available to everyone and things like Radar.io assigning public completion scores, everyone is expected to be fully optimized or not play the game. Because again, no one likes to play suboptimally. Ignorance truly is bliss.
I think he's using MMOs as an example, but this is true beyond like you need to be optimized. This also just touches on how people engage with games these days. They want a guide of where all the trinkets are. They want a guide of where all the things are. And I think there's such a weird interrelationship here of the games make themselves incredibly dense and bloated, and then there's tons to do, but it's so bloated that then people feel like they have to go and use a guide to find all the things. So then because people are using a guide to find all of the things, then the game developers feel like maybe they have to add more to the map because people are finding all of the things too easily or too quickly, or the guides are just making it so simple. So there's like this ping pong match back and forth of like, yeah, we added all this stuff, and because we added all this stuff, people felt almost helpless and paralyzed by it, so they went and used guides. But because people are using guides, we got to put more stuff in the map now, right? Like there's this weird back and forth between the two, the devs and the gamers. But I think we're having more games come out that aren't requiring this. Like maybe Assassin's Creed Mirage and the fact that you can platinum Spider-Man 2 in 30 hours, like maybe that can start to send a loud and clear message that you don't have to do that with your game. Like you do not need to overstuff it, because that genuinely does, I think that generally does drive people to the over maximizing it, right? And maximizing and optimizing the fun right out of the game. They know where all the trinkets and the checkpoints are.
It's my opinion that this is the real reason why World of Warcraft has been struggling. Like Asmongold has said, Blizzard has ignored the casual audience and failed to produce fun and compelling activities that aren't just about the optimization. Instead, they just continue to double down on the raids and dungeons, catering to this nature of gameplay. Now, as of this recording, Dragonflight has not released yet, so maybe that will be the expansion that fixes this issue. But it's not just retail. A lot of players were excited about Classic and logged in expecting to recapture that nostalgic sense of adventure. But things are too different now. The way we play games is too different now.
I so much agree with this. I've been so misunderstood whenever I've said that I can't go back to old games now. People think that I'm like saying that the old games aren't good. It's like, no, I've changed too much. I've changed way too much. I can't go back. There's too much of a metamorphosis within my mind, so I can't do it. I think this is well stated. It's so difficult to go back to old games. The nostalgia is in your mind, and it doesn't represent the product that well. You go back and play, and you're like, this is not how I remember it.
The game didn't seem nearly as hard as they remembered, the world not as vast. But I think it comes down to the fact that every facet of the game has been solved already, and that the joy of the original release lied in the discovery and the journey.
Right.
Now, this is not everyone's opinion. There's still plenty of people that very much enjoyed Classic. This is mostly just anecdotal sentiment from me and my friends. But I do think that this might be why so many people get excited whenever a new MMO is released. It's a chance to discover things for the first time, to not be beholden to the methods and builds that someone else already figured out and everyone is expected to use. A chance for you to be the one that discovers those methods. But
this is, again, well stated. Like, I know that happened with New World. It was the new car smell faded and everybody stopped playing, which is why I kept saying do servers where everything's reset, the land is reset, give people the new car smell, the fresh experience again. But I think to his point, you would have everything sort of maximized in your brain. There'd be guides, there'd be ways to level up fast and win PvP fast and take over the map fast, and you'd almost have to randomize it. You'd have to almost randomize it so that you can't do those things, so that the mystery and the discovery is brought back. This is why Elden Ring struck a chord with so many people. It's why Breath of the Wild struck a chord with so many people. The sense of exploratory purpose and dynamic discovery is like unmatched. And that's why when you go back and try to play those games the second time, it just doesn't work. Elden Ring replayability hurts because of those things. It's so big, so vast. You're not having those quality points hit the second time around. The dynamic discovery isn't there anymore. So now it just feels like another big giant open world that you have to hack your way through.
But for better or for worse, this is just the way the world is now. Maybe someday a game will come out that is immune to this phenomenon. A game that can't be solved, where the discovery never goes away. Doesn't seem possible, but who knows? Maybe someday.
All right, well, that's going to go into his final section where he talks about, like, have I changed? Like, he talks about have I changed? And again, the opening about the nostalgia is so good. So we're going to try to do reaction content like this where I don't replace the video. I don't like being a replacement to somebody else's content. I like to highlight it, point you to it, give some of my thoughts. The video will be linked below as well as to the channel. Make sure and support that creator and their video. Thanks so much for watching a video over here on Reforge Reacts. I'll see you in the next one.